In 1912, a wedding photo seemed perfect until historians noticed the hidden detail in the groom's hands. Welcome back to the channel, everyone. Today, I'm about to share with you one of the most unsettling discoveries in photographic history. What started as a routine archival project turned into something that still gives historians chills to this day. Before we dive in, if you enjoy mysterious stories and hidden histories, don't forget to hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow. Oh, and speaking of growing channels, I'm also developing a new channel focused on unsolved mysteries from around the world. You can find the link in the description below if you're interested in even more intriguing content. Now, let me ask you this. Have you ever looked at an old photograph and felt that something was off? That's exactly what happened when historians examined a seemingly perfect wedding portrait from 1912. What they found hidden in the groom's hands would forever change how we view this once cherished memory. The autumn of 2019 brought an unusual chill to the small town of Millbrook, Massachusetts. Sarah Chen, a digital archivist at the New England Historical Society, sat hunched over her desk, carefully scanning photographs that had been donated from the estate of Eleanor Whitmore, who had passed away at the remarkable age of 103. Most of the photographs were typical of the era: stiff family portraits, grainy landscapes, and the occasional candid moment caught on film. But one photograph made Sarah pause. It was a wedding portrait, remarkably well preserved, showing a young couple standing before the altar of what appeared to be St. Augustine's Church, a local landmark that still stood today. The bride, identified on the back as Margaret Whitmore, wore an elegant silk gown with intricate lace detailing. Her smile was radiant, her eyes full of hope. The groom, Thomas Aldridge, stood tall beside her in a crisp black suit, his hand gently resting on hers. Everything about the photograph seemed to radiate joy and promise. "Beautiful," Sarah murmured, adjusting her glasses as she prepared to scan the image at high resolution. The Historical Society had recently invested in state-of-the-art scanning equipment that could capture details invisible to the naked eye, revealing textures, inscriptions, and sometimes hidden damage that needed restoration. As the scanner hummed to life, Sarah noticed something odd. The photograph, despite being over a century old, showed surprisingly little aging. No yellowing, no significant fading. It was almost as if it had been preserved in a vacuum. She made a note in her catalogue: exceptional condition, possible special storage. The high-resolution scan completed, and Sarah opened the file on her monitor. She zoomed in to examine the faces more closely, a standard practice to check for any damage that might need digital restoration. Margaret's face was clear, her features sharp despite the limitations of early 20th century photography. But when Sarah moved to examine Thomas's face, she noticed something that made her lean closer to the screen. His eyes seemed wrong somehow. Not damaged or faded, but there was something in his expression that didn't match the joyous occasion. While his mouth smiled, his eyes held something else entirely. Fear? Resignation? Sarah couldn't quite place it. If you're enjoying this mystery so far, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. She zoomed out slightly, examining the full figure of the groom. That's when she saw it, or rather, saw what she almost missed. Thomas's hands, one resting on Margaret's and the other hanging at his side, appeared normal at first glance. But the high-resolution scan revealed something that made Sarah's breath catch. On his right hand, partially hidden by the angle and the formal positioning, there appeared to be markings, not tattoos. Those would have been scandalous for a man of his apparent social standing in 1912. These looked more like scratches, symbols. They were deliberate, that much was certain, carved or drawn into the skin in a pattern that seemed almost ritualistic. Sarah immediately called over her supervisor, Dr. James Morrison, a man who had spent 40 years studying New England history and had seen his share of unusual historical artifacts. "Jim, you need to see this," she said, her voice barely concealing her excitement. Dr. Morrison peered at the screen, his bushy eyebrows furrowing as he examined the detail Sarah had discovered. "Enhance it further," he said quietly. As Sarah increased the magnification, the markings became clearer. They weren't random scratches or injuries. They formed a deliberate pattern, 3 intersecting lines creating a shape that resembled a star, with smaller symbols radiating outward. The precision was unsettling. Whoever had made these marks had done so with careful intention. "I've never seen anything quite like this," Dr. Morrison admitted, pulling up a chair. "The positioning suggests he was trying to hide them, but why have them at all? And why wear them to your wedding?" Sarah was already pulling up the donation records. The photograph came from Eleanor Whitmore's estate. She was Margaret's daughter. She paused, reading further. Born in 1916, 4 years after this wedding. So Margaret lived a long life after this, Dr. Morrison mused. What about Thomas? Sarah's fingers flew across the keyboard, searching genealogical databases and historical records. What she found, or rather didn't find, sent a chill down her spine. There's no death record for Thomas Aldridge in Massachusetts, no burial record. After 1913, he simply vanishes from all documentation. Dr. Morrison leaned back in his chair. People didn't just disappear in 1913, not without leaving some trace. As they sat in the dimming light of the archive room, both historians knew they had stumbled upon something extraordinary. The perfect wedding photograph had revealed an imperfect secret, one that had been hiding in plain sight for over a century. Sarah printed out an enhanced image of the markings and pinned it to the board. I think we need to dig deeper into who Thomas Aldridge really was. Outside, the October wind rattled the windows, and somewhere in the building, a door slammed shut. But Sarah and Dr. Morrison were already lost in the mystery, unaware that their discovery would lead them down a path that would challenge everything they thought they knew about the difference between history and legend. The following morning arrived with an unseasonable frost that painted the windows of the Historical Society in delicate crystal patterns. Sarah had barely slept, her mind racing with questions about Thomas Aldridge and those mysterious markings. She arrived at the archive an hour before opening, finding Dr. Morrison already there, surrounded by old newspapers and town records. Couldn't sleep either, she asked, setting down 2 cups of coffee. Not a wink, he admitted, gratefully accepting the coffee. I've been going through the Millbrook Gazette archives from 1912 to 1913. Thomas Aldridge appears several times before the wedding. He was a banker at First National, well respected in the community. Then, after February 1913, nothing. Sarah pulled up the enhanced image of the markings on her computer. I've been researching these symbols. They don't match any common religious or cultural iconography from the period. But I did find something interesting. She opened another file, showing a sketch from a book dated 1889. This is from a journal kept by a traveling preacher named Reverend Josiah Blackwood. He documented what he called devil's marks he claimed to have seen during his travels through New England. The sketch showed symbols remarkably similar to those on Thomas's hand. Dr. Morrison adjusted his glasses, comparing the 2 images. The similarity is undeniable. But Blackwood was considered a fanatic, wasn't he? His writings were dismissed as the ravings of a madman. By most, yes, Sarah agreed. But what if he actually saw something? What if these markings were more common than we thought, just hidden? Let me know in the comments what you think about these mysterious markings. Their research was interrupted by the arrival of Martha Hendricks, the Society's eldest volunteer and unofficial keeper of local law. At 85, Martha had lived in Millbrook her entire life and possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of the town's history, both official and whispered. I heard you 2 were looking into the Aldridge family, she said without preamble, her sharp eyes twinkling with interest. News travels fast, Dr. Morrison said with a wry smile. What can you tell us about them? Martha settled into a chair with practiced ease. My grandmother knew Margaret Aldridge, née Whitmore. Said she was a lovely woman, but there was always a sadness about her, never remarried after Thomas disappeared. Disappeared? Sarah leaned forward. So it was known that he vanished? Oh yes, Martha nodded, though the family never spoke of it directly. The official story was that he went west for business and never returned, but my grandmother said Margaret would sometimes talk in her sleep, calling out for Thomas to come back from the dark. Dr. Morrison and Sarah exchanged glances. Did your grandmother ever mention anything unusual about Thomas before he disappeared? Martha's expression grew thoughtful. There was talk. There's always talk in a small town. Some said he'd been seen at strange hours, walking the woods beyond Millbrook. Others claimed he'd been visiting a woman who lived alone at the edge of town. Constance Gray, they called her. She was what polite folks would term eccentric. Is there any information about this Constance Gray? Sarah was already turning to her computer. She died in the influenza pandemic of 1918, Martha said, but her house still stands, or what's left of it. It's that ruined cottage off the old post road. Kids say it's haunted, but then kids say that about any abandoned building. Over the next several hours, the 3 of them pieced together a timeline of Thomas Aldridge's life. Born in 1886 to a prosperous Boston family educated at Harvard, he had arrived in Millbrook in 1910 to take a position at the bank. By all accounts, he was charming, intelligent, and ambitious. His courtship of Margaret Whitmore, daughter of one of the town's founding families, had been the social event of 1911. But starting in the autumn of 1912, just months after the wedding, there were subtle changes. Thomas began missing work, claiming illness. Several witnesses reported seeing him entering the woods at dusk. The bank's records, which Dr. Morrison managed to access through the Historical Society's connections, showed increasingly erratic behavior in his final months. Strange symbols doodled in the margins of ledgers, appointments cancelled without explanation. "I found something else," Sarah said, pulling up a scanned document. "This is from the police records. In January 1913, a month before Thomas disappeared, there was a report of vandalism at St. Augustine's Church, the same church where they were married. The report was brief but chilling. Someone had carved symbols into the wooden pews, symbols that, when Sarah enhanced the attached sketch, bore a striking resemblance to the marks on Thomas's hand. "He went back to the church," Dr. Morrison said quietly. "But why? If you're finding this investigation as intriguing as we are, please subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell." Martha stood, gathering her coat. "If you want to know more about Thomas Aldridge, you might want to visit the church. Father O'Brien is young, but he has access to all the old church records. And," she paused at the door, "you might ask him about the sealed crypt beneath the sanctuary, the one they found during renovations in the 1960s. After Martha left, Sarah and Dr. Morrison sat in silence for a moment, processing everything they'd learned. The wedding photograph still glowed on Sarah's monitor, the happy couple frozen in time, unaware that in less than a year the groom would vanish without a trace. "We need to be systematic about this," Dr. Morrison finally said. "Tomorrow, we visit the church. Then, Constance Gray's cottage. We follow the evidence wherever it leads." Sarah nodded, but as she looked at the enhanced image of those strange markings, she couldn't shake the feeling that some mysteries were meant to remain hidden. The rational part of her mind, the part trained in academic rigor and historical methodology, insisted there was a logical explanation for everything, but another part, a part she rarely acknowledged, whispered that they were uncovering something that defied conventional understanding. As they prepared to leave for the evening, Sarah made one last search in the genealogical database. She found what she was looking for, or rather, didn't find it. Thomas and Margaret Aldridge had no children recorded in 1913 or 1914. Eleanor, Margaret's daughter, wasn't born until 1916, 3 years after Thomas disappeared. The marriage certificate listed no father. "Jim," she called out as Dr. Morrison was putting on his coat, "there's something else." Eleanor Whitmore. She wasn't Thomas's daughter. Dr. Morrison stopped in the doorway, his face grave. "Then we have to ask ourselves what happened in those missing years, and why did Margaret keep his photograph all her life?" As they locked up the Historical Society, neither noticed the figure watching from across the street, someone who had been waiting over a century for this photograph to surface again. The morning sun struggled through heavy clouds as Sarah and Dr. Morrison stood before St. Augustine's Church. The Gothic revival structure loomed against the grey sky, its weathered stones holding over a century and a half of secrets. Father O'Brien, a surprisingly young priest with keen eyes and a firm handshake, met them at the heavy wooden doors. "Martha Hendricks called ahead," he said, leading them inside. "She said you were investigating something about the Aldridge family. I've pulled the records you might find interesting." The church interior was dimly lit, shafts of colored light filtering through stained glass windows, depicting scenes of redemption and damnation in equal measure. Their footsteps echoed on the stone floor as Father O'Brien led them to a small office behind the sanctuary. "The church maintains extensive records," he explained, producing several leather-bound volumes, marriages, baptisms, deaths, and occasionally more unusual entries. Sarah showed him the enhanced photograph, pointing out the markings on Thomas's hand. Father O'Brien's expression shifted, becoming guarded. "You've seen these symbols before," Dr. Morrison observed. The priest nodded slowly. "During the 1960s renovation, workers discovered a sealed crypt beneath the sanctuary. Inside, they found similar markings carved into the walls. The church ordered it resealed, but not before photographs were taken. He retrieved a manila folder from a locked drawer. extracting several black and white photographs. The images showed a small stone chamber, its walls covered in symbols that matched those on Thomas's hand, along with others even more complex and disturbing. "There's more," Father O'Brien continued. "The workers also found remains, not in any coffin or proper burial, but scattered as if someone had been trying to prevent something from being found intact." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. "Whose remains?" "Unknown, but they dated to the early 1900s. The church quietly had them cremated and interred in the cemetery." He paused. There was also a journal, partially destroyed. Only fragments remained legible. He produced a photocopy of the journal pages. The handwriting was cramped, desperate, but Sarah recognized it immediately from the bank ledgers they'd examined. "This is Thomas's handwriting," she breathed. The legible fragments were disturbing. "The bargain cannot be undone. She promises power beyond measure, but the cost. Margaret must never know. The marks burn even now. Tried to break free, but the roots run too deep. Constance says there is a way, but I fear. Darkness calls and I answer. Forgive me, my love. By the time you read this, I will be beyond. The church may hold me, but it cannot contain what I've become." Dr. Morrison studied the pages intently. He was trying to stop something, or stop himself from becoming something. "There's a local legend," Father O'Brien said quietly, "about a group that met in the woods beyond Millbrook in the early 1900s. They called themselves Seekers of Hidden Knowledge, but others had different names for them." "Constance Gray was part of this group?" Sarah asked. "According to the stories, she led it. They were said to practice rituals, seeking power through bargains with things better left unnamed. The priest led them back into the sanctuary, to a section of pews near the back. This is where the vandalism was found in 1913. The symbols were carved deep into the wood. We had to replace the entire pew." Sarah ran her fingers along the smooth wood of the replacement pew, imagining Thomas here in the dark, carving desperately, trying to what? Warn others, break free. The journal fragments suggested both. "Can we see the sealed crypt?" Dr. Morrison asked. Father O'Brien shook his head. "The bishop's orders were clear. It remains sealed. But," he glanced around as if checking they were alone, "I can tell you what else the workers found. There were scratches on the inside of the ceiling stones, as if something had tried to claw its way out." After leaving the church, Sarah and Dr. Morrison drove in silence to the outskirts of town. The old post road had long been abandoned in favor of the newer highway, and nature had begun reclaiming it. They parked where the road became impassable and continued on foot. Constance Gray's cottage appeared through the trees like something from a nightmare. What remained of the structure was overgrown with vines, the roof collapsed, walls crumbling. But the stone foundation remained solid, and carved into the cornerstone were symbols now familiar to both historians. "She marked her territory," Sarah said, photographing the symbols. They explored carefully, aware of the unstable structure. In what had once been the main room, they found evidence of a stone circle set into the floor, its purpose unclear, but its deliberate construction evident. "Look at this," Dr. Morrison called from what remained of a back room. Sarah joined him, finding him staring at the remnants of a wall where someone had carved words, barely visible beneath decades of decay. "Thomas A. The compact is sealed. Payment comes due at the turning of the season. What is given cannot be returned." Below this, in what appeared to be different handwriting, "He thinks love will save him. He is wrong. The old ones do not forgive broken promises." Sarah photographed everything, her hands trembling slightly. The rational explanation, that Thomas had become involved with a cult, that guilt and possibly mental illness had driven him to disappear, seemed less and less adequate to explain what they were finding. As they prepared to leave, Dr. Morrison stopped suddenly. "Do you hear that?" Sarah listened. Beyond the normal forest sounds there was something else, a rhythmic creaking, like old wood swaying in the wind. But there was no wind. They followed the sound to a cluster of ancient oaks behind the cottage. Hanging from one massive branch was what remained of a wooden sign, weathered beyond reading. But carved into the tree itself were more symbols, and a date, February 13th, 1913. "The day before Valentine's Day," Sarah noted. "The day Thomas disappeared." As they made their way back to the car, Sarah's phone buzzed. She had a message from Martha Hendricks. "Found something you need to see. Eleanor Whitmore's diary. Come quickly." The drive back to town felt longer than it had that morning. The shadows seemed deeper, the forest more oppressive. Neither Sarah nor Dr. Morrison spoke, but both were thinking the same thing. They were uncovering something that perhaps should have remained buried. Back at the Historical Society, Martha was waiting with a small leather journal. "Eleanor gave this to me years ago," she explained. "Asked me to keep it safe but never said why. After our conversation yesterday, I thought to look through it again." Sarah opened the diary carefully. Most entries were mundane, the daily life of a woman in mid-20th century New England. But one entry, dated October 31st, 1962, stood out. "Mother is dying. In her delirium, she speaks of father. Not the man who raised me, but Thomas. She says he came back once in 1916, the night I was conceived. She says he wasn't human anymore, but she loved him still. She says I have his eyes. When I look in the mirror, I wonder what she meant. My eyes are normal, aren't they? Aren't they?" Dr. Morrison sat down heavily. "This is suggesting that Thomas returned 3 years after disappearing." "But returned as what?" Sarah asked, though she feared she already knew the answer. Martha spoke quietly. "My grandmother said Margaret Aldridge never removed her wedding ring. Said she was waiting for her husband to come home. Maybe he did, just not in the way anyone expected." As night fell over Millbrook, the three sat in the archive, surrounded by evidence of something that defied conventional historical interpretation. The wedding photograph still glowed on Sarah's monitor, but now she saw it differently. The markings on Thomas's hand weren't just symbols. They were a warning, a desperate attempt to document what was happening to him. And somewhere in the darkness beyond the windows, something watched and waited, just as it had for over a century. The next morning brought no relief from the oppressive atmosphere that had settled over their investigation. Sarah arrived at the Historical Society to find Dr. Morrison already there, but he wasn't alone. A woman in her 60s stood beside him, her striking eyes, an unusual amber color, studying the wedding photograph on the monitor. "Sarah, this is Patricia Aldridge Morrison," Dr. Morrison said, and Sarah noticed the slight tremor in his voice. "She's Eleanor Whitmore's daughter, and my cousin, though I hadn't seen her in 40 years. Patricia's smile was sad. "When James called me last night about your discovery, I knew it was time. I've been carrying this burden alone for too long." She placed a leather satchel on the table, extracting several items, more photographs, letters tied with faded ribbon, and a journal bound in an unusual dark material. "My mother left these to me with strict instructions. I was to destroy them, or, if I couldn't bring myself to do that, ensure they never became public, but I've lived with these secrets eating at me, and I'm tired of hiding the truth." Sarah examined the photographs first. They showed Margaret Aldridge at various ages, always beautiful, but with an increasing sadness in her eyes. In several, taken in the 1920s and 1930s, there were strange blurs and distortions around the edges, as if something had interfered with the photographic process. "My grandmother claimed she could feel him," Patricia said quietly. "Thomas. She said he never truly left, that he existed in the spaces between light and shadow. The photographs sometimes caught traces of his presence." Dr. Morrison picked up one particular photograph, dated 1925. It showed Margaret sitting in a garden, and behind her, barely visible, was what might have been a figure or merely a trick of shadow and light. But the longer Sarah looked, the more convinced she became that someone, something, stood watching just outside the frame. "This journal," Patricia continued, touching the dark binding, "was Thomas's. Grandmother found it in the sealed crypt when she broke in there in 1916. Yes," she added, seeing their shocked expressions, "she broke the church's seal. She was desperate to find answers." Sarah opened the journal carefully. The pages were filled with Thomas's increasingly frantic handwriting, documenting his involvement with Constance Gray's group and the terrible price of the knowledge they sought. December 3rd, 1912. The ceremony was everything Constance promised. I felt the veil between worlds grow thin, saw truths that mathematics and science could never reveal. But something saw me in return. It knows my name now. December 15th, 1912. The marks appeared overnight. They burn like ice and fire combined. Constance says they're a sign of favor, but I see them for what they are, chains, binding me to promises I didn't fully understand. January 8th, 1913. Margaret suspects nothing, bless her innocent heart. How can I tell her that her husband is becoming something else? That the man she married is being hollowed out from within, replaced by something ancient and hungry. January 20th, 1913. Tried to break the compact. Constance laughed. She says the old ones don't release their servants easily. The transformation accelerates. I can feel myself slipping away, becoming less Thomas and more vessel. February 10th, 1913. 3 days left. Constance says the final change happens on the anniversary of the binding. I've made my choice. Better to die as Thomas than live as their thing. The church crypt has protections, old ones, from when priests knew what lurked in darkness. If I seal myself within. February 13th, 1913. This is my last entry as a man. The hunger grows. I can hear them calling. But I will not answer. Margaret, if you find this, know that I loved you more than my own soul. That's why I must go. The thing I'm becoming would wear my face, but it wouldn't be me. Remember me as I was, not as what I might have become. Sarah's hands shook as she turned the page, finding one final entry in different handwriting. Cruder, as if written by someone struggling to remember how to form letters. February 14th, 1916. Found way back, not man, not thing. Between, Margaret knows. Still loves. Child will be bridge. Old one's patient. Time means nothing. Thomas sleeps. I wake. We are one. We are none. The compact continues. My mother, Patricia said softly, was conceived on Valentine's Day, 1916, 3 years after Thomas disappeared. Grandmother never spoke of that night, but she wrote about it once, in a letter she never sent. She produced a yellowed envelope, the letter within written in Margaret's delicate script. My dearest sister, you will think me mad, but I must tell someone. He came back, not as he was, but as something between states. For one night, the man I married looked through those changed eyes, spoke with that altered voice. He begged my forgiveness and my understanding. What we created that night was born of love and something else, something older than love, older than human emotion. Eleanor carries both bloodlines now. I see it in her eyes sometimes, that amber flash that was never in my family or his. I pray she never knows. I pray the inheritance passes her by. But if it doesn't, if she begins to change as he did, know that it isn't evil, it's evolution, a joining of what was and what might be. He couldn't stay. The morning light drove him back to the spaces between, but I know he watches. I feel him in the shadows, in the moments between heartbeats. My wedding ring grows cold when he's near, and I welcome that chill. Forgive me for burdening you with this truth, but someone must know in case Eleanor needs answers someday. Your loving sister, Margaret Dr. Morrison, had grown pale. Patricia, are you saying that our family carries something otherworldly? Patricia's amber eyes seem to glow in the archive's fluorescent lighting. Yes. Most of us only show subtle signs, unusual eye color, sensitivity to certain times and places, dreams of spaces that don't exist in normal geometry. But occasionally, she trailed off, and Sarah found herself studying Patricia's features more carefully. There was something unsettling about the way shadows seemed to bend around her, how her reflection in the computer monitor didn't quite match her movements. My son, Patricia continued, began showing stronger signs at 13. He could see things others couldn't, knew things he shouldn't. We had to teach him to hide it, to appear normal. He lives in Alaska now, as far from populated areas as possible. He says the cold helps keep the other side quiet. Why are you telling us this? Sarah asked, though she suspected she knew. Because the compact Thomas made isn't finished. Constance Gray may be dead, but the things she served don't die. They wait. And lately, I've been feeling them stir. The barriers are thinning again. The old markers are being found. She gestured to the photograph. This wasn't donated by accident. Someone wanted it discovered. Someone who knows the bloodline continues. As if in response to her words, the lights in the archive flickered. The temperature dropped noticeably, and Sarah's breath misted in the suddenly frigid air. On the computer monitor, the wedding photograph began to change. The shadows deepened, and in them, shapes moved that hadn't been there before. He's here, Patricia whispered. He always comes when the family secrets are spoken aloud. The photograph continued to shift. Thomas's figure became clearer and yet more alien. His human form overlaid with something else, something that existed in too many dimensions for the human eye to properly process. And in the background, barely visible, stood other figures, Constance Gray and her followers, frozen in time but somehow still aware, still watching. Then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The light steadied. The temperature returned to normal, and the photograph reverted to its original appearance. But all three of them had seen the truth hidden beneath the surface. Patricia stood, gathering the documents. Keep investigating if you must. But know this, Some doors, once opened, can never be fully closed. Thomas learned that too late. Don't make his mistake. She left them with one final gift. A small silver locket that had belonged to Margaret. Inside was a miniature of the wedding portrait and a lock of hair that seemed to shift color in the light. Sometimes black, sometimes silver, sometimes something else entirely. She wore this always, Patricia said. Said it helped her remember him as he was and accept him as he became. After Patricia left, Sarah and Dr. Morrison sat in stunned silence. Everything they thought they knew about historical investigation had been challenged. The wedding photograph still glowed innocently on the screen, but now they knew the terrible truth it concealed. "What do we do with this?" Sarah finally asked. Dr. Morrison removed his glasses, rubbing his tired eyes. "We're historians. We document truth, however strange, but perhaps some truths are too heavy for the world to bear." As they debated, neither noticed that the photograph had begun to change again, subtly this time. In Thomas's eyes, something ancient stirred, waiting for the next chapter in a story that had begun over a century ago and was far from over. 1 week after Patricia's visit, Sarah found herself standing in Millbrook Cemetery as the last light of day faded from the sky. She clutched a folder containing everything they had discovered, unsure whether she was there to find answers or to say goodbye to the investigation that had consumed her thoughts. Margaret Aldridge's grave stood in the older section of the cemetery, her headstone simple but elegant. Margaret Whitmore Aldridge, 1890–1968. Love transcends all boundaries. Beside it, an empty plot bore a smaller stone. Thomas James Aldridge, 1886. Until we meet again. The absence of a death date seemed more ominous now, knowing what Sarah knew. As she knelt to place flowers at Margaret's grave, she noticed something she'd missed in the photographs. Small symbols carved into the base of both headstones, weathered but still visible. The same marks that had started this journey. "I thought I might find you here." Sarah turned to find an elderly man approaching, his gait steady despite his obvious age. Something about his eyes, that amber flash in the dying light, made her heart skip. "You're Patricia's son," she said. It wasn't a question. He smiled sadly. "David Aldridge. I heard you've been investigating my family's history. I came back from Alaska when Mother told me. There are things you need to know, things even she doesn't fully understand." They walked among the graves as David spoke, his voice carrying an otherworldly quality that made Sarah shiver. "The change isn't a curse," he began. "It's an evolution. Thomas discovered something that night with Constance Gray, that humanity stands at a threshold. We can remain as we are, limited by our single dimension of existence, or we can become something more. But at what cost?" Sarah asked. "That's the question, isn't it? Thomas thought he was losing his humanity. In truth, he was gaining so much more. Awareness of realities beyond our narrow perception, ability to exist in multiple states simultaneously. But the process, it's terrifying. Imagine suddenly seeing with 1,000 eyes, thinking with a mind that spans dimensions. Most go mad." They stopped at a mausoleum near the back of the cemetery. David produced an old key. "This belongs to Constance Gray's family. After she died, my grandmother bought it. She knew others would come looking for Constance's work." Inside, the walls were covered with documents, photographs, and artifacts. It was a hidden archive of the occult history of Millbrook. "My God," Sarah breathed, taking in the collection. "Thomas tried to resist because he didn't understand," David continued, lighting a lantern. "He saw it as corruption, invasion. But look." He showed her a journal in Constance's hand, dated 1910. "The old ones aren't gods or demons. They're what we will become given time. They reached this state eons ago and wait patiently for us to join them. The rituals, the marks, the bargains, all just catalysts to speed our evolution. But fear makes the process traumatic. Thomas fears, and so he suffers. Constance wasn't evil," David said. "She was a visionary who saw humanity's future, but she underestimated how terrifying that future would seem to those unprepared." Sarah studied the photographs covering one wall, all showing people with the same marks Thomas bore, all dated between 1900 and 1920. There were others, dozens. Most fled Millbrook when the change began. Some, like Thomas, tried to stop it. A few embraced it fully. He pointed to one photograph of a woman whose face seemed to exist in multiple exposures simultaneously. She learned to control it, to shift between states at will. She lived until 1987, though lived isn't quite the right word. David led her deeper into the mausoleum, to a section that felt older, colder. On a stone pedestal sat an ornate box. "This is why I really brought you here," he said. "Mother doesn't know this exists. Grandmother left it in my keeping, with instructions to open it only when the time was right." Inside the box was another photograph, the same wedding portrait Sarah had been studying, but this one was different. It moved, shifted, showed the truth beneath the static image. She watched Thomas and Margaret's wedding day unfold in impossible detail, saw the moments between moments, and she saw Thomas's hand as he placed the ring on Margaret's finger. The marks were already there, but in this version they glowed with a light that wasn't quite light, revealing their true nature. Not wounds or brands, but apertures, openings to something greater. "This is a dimensional photograph," David explained. "Constance created a few before she died. They show reality as the evolved see it, all states simultaneously." In the moving image, Sarah saw the wedding guests, some human, others not quite. She saw Constance Gray in the back row, her form shifting between an elderly woman and something geometric and impossible, and she saw Thomas's expression, not fear, as she'd thought, but awe and terrible understanding. "He knew even then," David said quietly. "The marks appeared the night before the wedding. He could have called it off, fled Millbrook, but he loved Margaret too much to abandon her, so he married her, hoping love would be enough to anchor him to humanity." "Oh, was it?" David's smile was sad. Yes and no. Love kept him tethered longer than most, but eventually the pull became too strong. He exists now in the spaces between spaces, watching over his bloodline, waiting. Waiting for what? For us to be ready, for humanity to accept that the next step in our evolution isn't technological or biological. It's dimensional. We're caterpillars afraid of becoming butterflies because we can't imagine thinking without caterpillar brains. Sarah felt overwhelmed. Everything she'd believed about reality was crumbling. "Why show me this? Why now?" David's amber eyes caught the lantern light. "Because the barriers are thinning again. More people are being marked, having visions, sensing the greater reality. The old ones are stirring because humanity is approaching a tipping point. We need people like you, historians, truth seekers, to help others understand this isn't horror, it's transformation." He handed her a small leather journal. "This is Thomas's final gift. He gave it to my grandmother in 1962, the last time he managed to fully materialize. It contains instructions, warnings, and hope for those who will follow." Sarah opened it to find Thomas's handwriting, clear and steady. "To those who seek truth in the shadows of history, know that love transcends dimensions as surely as fear imprisons us within them. What seems monstrous is merely misunderstood. We are all becoming something greater than ourselves. The marks I bear are not chains but keys. Each symbol opens a door to perception beyond human limitation. I was afraid, and my fear made the transition agony. Learn from my mistake. When your time comes, and it will come for all humanity eventually, embrace the change. I watch still from the spaces between. I am not lost, merely transformed. Margaret knows this. Our love endures across states of being. To my descendants who carry the gift in their blood, you are bridges between what was and what will be. Do not fear your inheritance. You are evolution's ambassadors. The photograph that began your journey shows a moment when two realities touched. In your world, it was our wedding day. In the greater reality, it was the beginning of humanity's next chapter. Remember us not with sorrow, but with understanding. We are all walking toward the same destination. Some of us simply arrived early. Thomas James Aldridge, written between the seconds existing in all states forever. As Sarah finished reading, she realized the mausoleum had changed. The walls seemed less solid, more permeable. Through them, she caught glimpses of other spaces, other times. And in those spaces, figures moved that might have been human once. "Do you see them?" David asked gently. She nodded, unable to speak. The evolved ones, the transformed, those who had embraced what Thomas had feared. They weren't monsters. They were what waited beyond the cocoon of limited perception. "The photograph will continue to surface," David said as they prepared to leave. "Others will investigate, will find what you found. Each discovery weakens the barriers a little more, prepares humanity a little better. One day, the distinction between human and evolved will disappear entirely." Outside the mausoleum, Millbrook looked different to Sarah. She could see the spaces between buildings, the moments between seconds. The effect was fading, but the memory would remain. "What do I do now?" she asked. David smiled. Whatever feels right. Share the story or keep it secret. Prepare others or let them discover truth in their own time. But know this, you've been touched by the greater reality. You'll never see the world quite the same way again. He walked away, and for a moment, Sarah saw him as he truly was, existing in multiple states, part human, part something luminous and mathematical. Then he was just an old man disappearing into the cemetery's shadows. Sarah stood alone among the graves, the wedding photograph in her hand. She understood now why it had survived so perfectly for over a century. It wasn't just a photograph, it was a window, a promise, a warning, and an invitation all at once. The marks on Thomas's hand no longer seemed sinister. They were humanity's future, written in flesh, a transformation that couldn't be stopped, only feared or embraced. As she walked back to her car, Sarah made her decision. The world wasn't ready for the full truth, but perhaps it could handle pieces. She would write the historical article, include the mysterious marks, let others draw their own conclusions, plant seeds of understanding for the changes to come. But tonight, she would go home and look at her own hands in the mirror, wondering if she would see the first faint traces of marks appearing, wondering if Thomas and Constance and all the evolved ones were watching from their spaces between spaces, waiting patiently for humanity to join them in the greater reality. The wedding photograph remained in the archives, innocent and beautiful and terrible. And somewhere, in dimensions folded beyond human perception, Thomas Aldridge smiled, knowing that love had indeed transcended all boundaries, even those between human and what comes after. The compact continued. The evolution proceeded, and in Millbrook, Massachusetts, the barriers grew a little thinner with each passing day. Well, there you have it, the unsettling truth behind the 1912 wedding photograph. What started as a routine archival discovery led us down a path that challenged everything we thought we knew about the boundaries of reality. The marks on Thomas Aldridge's hands remain a mystery. Were they symbols of an otherworldly compact? Signs of humanity's next evolutionary step, or something else entirely that our limited perception cannot fully grasp? Perhaps the most disturbing aspect is that we may never know for certain. What do you think about this story? Have you ever encountered photographs or artifacts that seem to hold secrets beyond their surface? Leave a comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts and theories about what really happened to Thomas Aldridge. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of history's most enigmatic photographs, please subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you won't miss our next investigation. These mysteries from the past have a way of finding us when we least expect them. Remember, sometimes the most innocent-looking photographs hide the darkest secrets. And sometimes what we fear as darkness is simply a reality our eyes aren't yet evolved enough to see. Until next time, keep questioning what you see, because history is never quite what it seems. View the 1912 wedding photograph mystery.